Yes, my name is Thomas Prymak, and I'm a historian at the University of Toronto. I'm an affiliate of the Chair of Ukrainian Studies in the Departments of History and Political Science. And I write about Ukrainian history and a little bit about the Middle East and sometimes about medieval Europe. So those are my main fields, and my most recent book is called Ukraine, the Middle East, and the West. And I bring two of my interests together in this book, Ukrainian interests and Middle Eastern interests. And the book consists of a number of different chapters on different themes. It covers art, history, literature, and legend, those general characteristics. And there are 9 chapters, a long introductory essay, and 3 appendices. And each of these is grouped into clusters. The first one is on history, the second one, and mostly travel to the Middle East, and with a general introduction on Ukrainian history and how it has been written up to the present time. The second general section is on literature, and I discuss 2 major figures of Ukrainian literature, Mykhailo Maksymovych and Taras Shevchenko. And in particular, I focus on Shevchenko's contacts with the Caucasus and his famous poem Kavkaz about the revolt of Imam Shamil, the leader of the mountaineers in the Caucasus, who was leading the resistance to Russian interference and aggression and conquest in that area. So that's the second part. The third part deals with, there are 2 chapters in the third part, and it deals with the West more than the Middle East, and Ukraine's contact with the West. And it focuses particularly on France and 2 French writers. The first one was Honoré de Balzac, who was a very well-known French writer and who was considered to be the father of French realistic novels. He was the first one to really experiment with realism in France, and he wrote an enormous number of books. And he spent the last 2 years of his life, at least most of the last 2 years of his life, in Ukraine, where he lived on an estate on the right bank and got to know something of the country, although I argue in this particular essay that he didn't know all that much. The second French writer that I deal with is Mérimée. He was a contemporary of Balzac. Both of them were 19th century writers. And Mérimée wrote an entire book about Bohdan Khmelnytsky, very little known today, hardly ever cited. I've never seen it cited in a work in English. But he wrote it in the middle of the 19th century, and it's a significant work. He was also interested in Gogol and his role in Russian literature and European literature, and he wrote other things as well. So that's the third section. The final section deals with art, and I have two essays in that section. One on a painter, very well-known painter, Rembrandt, who painted this picture called today The Polish Rider. And I analyze this picture, go into its origin, and describe its connections with Ukraine, and there are some. Finally, there is an entire chapter on Ilya Repin's famous painting of the Zaporozhian Cossacks writing their satirical letter to the Turkish Sultan, in which they call the Sultan all kinds of terrible names and defy his request for them to submit to him. So that's the final essay. And then there are 3 appendices, quite substantial appendices. The most important ones of these, I think, are probably the one on Orientalisms in the Ukrainian language and also in Russian and Polish. And by Orientalisms, I mean words of Oriental or Eastern origin. And there are a lot of them, about 4,000 ones from these languages. And there are also place names of Oriental origin and other things too. These are broken down into 3 or 4 different kinds. Firstly, there are the Iranianisms, words in Ukrainian from the Iranian languages. And these go back very far in history, but we can get into that later in the interview. Secondly, there are Turkisms in the Ukrainian language, and there are an awful lot of them, especially to do with Cossacks. The word Cossack itself is originally a Turkic word loaned into Ukrainian, and from Ukrainian to French and Polish, and then from French and Polish into English. And finally, there is a little appendix on Shevchenko and the Muslims. Shevchenko came into contact with Muslims in Central Asia during his exile there. And of course, he wrote that famous poem, Kavkaz, dealing with the mountaineers' resistance to the Russians. And the mountaineers were solidly Muslim and some very fanatically so. So that's the general scheme of the book. And as I say, it deals with Ukraine, the Middle East, and the West. This book has a very long history, actually. I've been writing these essays on and off for almost 15 years, I think, 15 or 20 years. And it goes back to when I had finished an earlier book on Mykola Kostomarov, a historian. And I had been very intensely working on Ukrainian history and Ukrainian historians and biographies of Ukrainian historians. But I was interested in other things too. And I had always had an interest in the Middle East. And this grew over the years, over the decades. It began with the Middle Ages and the Crusades and things like that. And then I traveled to the Middle East. I visited Turkey, and I became very interested in Turkey. I was fascinated by the culture. And then eventually I married a girl from Iran, and I developed an interest in Iran as well. So you put the two together, you've got Ukraine and you've got the Middle East, and there we have 3/4 of another book. There's very little scholarship on this subject. There is beginning to become some now, but we all know that for about 70 years, most of Ukraine was cut off from the rest of the world by the Iron Curtain and by very severe censorship. And during that period, there was very little talk and very little scholarship about Ukraine and the outside world, not just the Middle East, but the whole outside world. And the censorship basically prohibited any discussion of positive influences coming from outside of the Soviet Union. And beyond that, all foreign influences on Ukraine had to come via Russia, because all good things came from Russia and bad things came from elsewhere. So that was the general approach in Soviet times. And that isolated the country, and I think to some degree impoverished the scholarship of those days. So we have to correct that, and that's beginning to be done today in Ukraine. There is an Institute of Oriental Studies and Eastern, Svorozhnostwo, they call it in Ukrainian, Eastern Studies. And they're active, and they're beginning to produce more and more every year. And some of it is very good scholarship, especially having to do with the Cossacks and the Turks and the Tatars and that sort of thing. But I go beyond that in this particular book. I talk about medieval pilgrims to the Holy Land coming from Ukraine, medieval travelers to Byzantium, and then Byzantium beyond to Syria and Palestine and elsewhere, travelers in Egypt, that sort of thing. And I go from ancient, from almost ancient times, but certainly from medieval times, beginning with the abbot Danylo, who was the first one from Kyiv-Rus to write down what he saw there in the Holy Land and come back and describe it for others. And that goes right back to almost to the beginning of Kyiv-Rus. So there is one interesting point that I learned during this research, and that is the very common Ukrainian name, Roman. Now, those of us who know Ukrainian society know that there are an awful lot of Romans around. But where does this name come from? You don't see it very often in Western Europe, and you don't see it quite as much in other Slavic countries, but it's very, very common in Ukraine. And it has a history. This name goes back to when travelers from Kyiv-Rus would go to Palestine on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and they would pass through the Byzantine Empire on their way to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was in those days ruled by the Muslims, and in between Ukraine, Kyiv-Rus, and the Muslim countries was Byzantium, the great medieval empire descended from ancient Rome. And the Byzantines never called themselves Byzantines as we call them today. They called themselves Romans. So people who had been passed through the Byzantine Empire came back to Ukraine, and they were given the honorific title Roman, a person who has been to the Roman Empire. So that's where this very common Ukrainian name comes from. Very few people know this, so I think that's an interesting footnote. One of the most startling, and I've actually written an additional essay on this just recently, is about this letter of the Zaporozhians to the Sultan and where it came from. You know that the Zaporozhians were replying to the Sultan. The Sultan had written to the Zaporozhians, I order you to submit to me because I'm the grand ruler of such and so many countries, and I'm the shadow of God and all this sort of thing, So, and they wrote this response. But in that same letter, the Sultan calls himself the protector of Christians. So, what does that mean, the protector of? Well, the Muslims had a place for Christians in their lands, and they were considered to be a protected people of the book, like Jews and Christians are people mentioned in the Quran. They're people of the book, and they're people with their own recognized revelation, not perfect, but recognized. So there is that phrase in it there. Now, at the same time, the ideology was and the basic thrust was that the whole world is divided into the lands of Islam and the lands of war beyond Islam. And the lands of Islam should always be expanding and the land of war always contracting. Now, before they conquered any country or before they attacked any country, it was customary to write a letter to the ruler of that country asking them to submit, advising them to submit, and offering them protection and liberty of property and liberty of religion within the world of Islam if they would submit. If not, there would be war. Now, this custom is very, very old. It just didn't happen with the Cossacks. It happened in 1453 when the Turks attacked Constantinople and conquered it, and it became Istanbul. They sent a letter first to the Byzantine Emperor asking him to submit. They did the same thing in Vienna in 1683. The Sultan wrote, or the Sultan or his Grand Vizier, I don't recall which, wrote to the Emperor in Vienna saying, submit and you'll get protection. If you don't, it means war. So this was a kind of like part of the rules of war for the Islamic world. Now, this goes back very, very far. It goes right back to the Prophet Muhammad, who supposedly wrote to the Emperor of Byzantium, the Shah of Iran, and the ruler of Ethiopia, doing the same thing and advising them to submit to the law of Islam. Now, few people seem to know it, realize it, but in the late 1990s, in 1998 to be exact, Osama bin Laden wrote to the Arabic newspaper in London, England, the same type of letter, saying, the West has done such terrible things in the Middle East. We invite you to accept the law of Islam. If you don't, we'll attack you. And this was generally ignored by the public. But sure enough, on September 11th, 2001, the attacks came. And they came in New York and Washington, and we all saw them on television. So there's a link between the Zaporozhian Cossacks writing their letter to the Sultan, defying him, and the attacks on New York and Washington in 2001. So that came to me as a bit of a surprise. Wow. In the book, I describe all of these gentlemen and try to lay out their place in Ukrainian and in European history, and the contacts that they had with, in the case of Shevchenko, with the Middle East, in the case of Maksymovych with Western Europe, and the case of Balzac and Mérimée, the two French writers, their interests in Ukraine. And the idea here is that Ukraine was not completely isolated throughout its history. It wasn't all on its own. It had relations with all of these people and all of these countries, and they were sometimes quite profound and influential. To take the case of Shevchenko, this particular poem that I discuss on the Caucasus, Kafkaz, some people believe it to be his most important political poem. It's the one that's most fiery and attacks the Russian imperial order very severely, defends the right of peoples to independence, and he just doesn't talk about Ukraine. He talks about others, from Moldavia to the Finns. So it's quite a striking poem in which you have an element of Ukrainian national feeling, very, very important, and also a general anti-imperial sentiment that goes far beyond local nationalism and local patriotism. So that's a major theme in that particular poem and that particular chapter. And in some ways, it's the centerpiece of the entire book. It's located in the middle of the book, and it's the centerpiece in some ways ideologically as well. So that's Shevchenko. And of course, we all know that Shevchenko is probably the most important Ukrainian poet of the modern age. So that's Shevchenko. The French are quite interesting, actually. Balzac has a very peculiar story, because he was known as a realist writer, and he was idealized by the left wing in 19th century Europe. In particular, I think Marx and Engels admired him, read him. They tried to write. They enjoyed his works immensely, and they thought of him as being a progressive figure. But he himself was not left wing in the least. He was very right-wing. He was, in fact, an ultra-monarchist, and he was smashing away at the bourgeois order. And his idea was to destroy the bourgeois order and restore the old monarchy, restore the old order, the ancien regime in Europe. But Marx saw this destructive kind of behavior as being progressive. If you destroy the bourgeois order, then you can build a future order based on the working class. So in a way, they used Balzac in a way that Balzac was not quite aware of. And Balzac turned the tables on them when the communists took over in Russia, because Balzac became an accepted figure in Russia, and his works were printed and translated in many, many volumes. I think there's a 20-volume edition at one point, a 15-volume edition in another. And he becomes an iconic figure in Soviet culture. But this iconic figure would have nothing to do with communism. Were he alive today, would be absolutely appalled, and really was the ideological opposite. So the Soviets had to do kind of ideological acrobatics and how to explain that he was a progressive writer in their view. So that's a very interesting idea, and I go into that in some detail as well. And then there is the personal story of Balzac and Madame Rzhevska, who, Hanska is her married name, Madame Hanska, Eve as he called her, Hanska, who was a great aristocrat from right bank Ukraine, and they fell in love. He fell in love with her first, and she fell in love with his writings, and they fell in love, and he eventually moved to Ukraine, where he got very sick, and then he went back to Paris and died. So that's a very interesting love story as well. So you have the idea of Balzac, the realist writer, who is, when it comes to real life, is not realistic at all, but very romantic. And that story of that romance is told in that chapter as well. Mérimée is a different character entirely. He's nothing romantic about him, really. His style is very classic. It's very terse and very plain. But at the same time, he picks unusual topics. He was interested in the exotic. And he was interested in a little bit the Rousseau noble savage idea, you know. Now that does have a romantic edge to it. But you get this classical style melted with romantic interests in Mérimée. And out of that comes an interest in the Cossacks of Ukraine and the population of Corsica, which was at that time considered very, very sauvage in French eyes, very wild and unruly. And so you have Mérimée's interest in the edge of civilization and culture there and what people are like there. And that's how he gets interested in Ukraine. And eventually he writes this entire book on Khmelnytsky, and he writes essays on others as well. He gets very interested in Gogol and writes a lot about him, popularizes him in France. And he is actually the first major French writer to popularize Russian literature at the time within the French-speaking world. And virtually everybody who has studied French literature outside of France has studied Mérimée, because his writing is very easy to read in French, and it's a good place for people to begin. So it's very well known, and his name is very well known. So he's the second one, and he's in contrast to Balzac in some ways. One being very, very realistic writer, but romantic in life. The other being very classical in his writing, but acquiring an interest in foreign and exotic places. So that's them. So those are the two that the three that you asked about. The question of the personal and history has always been important to me, and there's a story behind that too. It goes back to my very first years in university, when I read this writer, popular at the time, named Will Durant. And he wrote a great history of civilization called The Story of Civilization in many, many volumes. And his technique was to do the biography, history as biography. And history as biography is a very, very interesting thing. It's interesting not just for specialists, but for the general public, because they can relate to personal stories. And at that time, I acquired this technique during my student years of writing about people as much as events. And people are important, and sometimes they're crucial to the course of history. In fact, usually they're crucial to the course of history. And general political events and other things are determined by personality to some degree. So, but that mix is very important. Sometimes hard to figure out, but it's there. And I particularly like this personal and history, and I like doing biography. So, and I'm glad that other people like it as well. How much of Ukrainian history needs to be rewritten is a very, very deep question. The simple answer, of course, is everything, or nearly everything. Because there was severe censorship, because everything was tilted in a certain direction, and because so much was left out, and other things were distorted. So in a way, those people who feel that everything should be rewritten were correct. More profound questions are, how do you do that? And what are you going to replace it with? In this particular book that we're discussing today, I tackle one aspect of that, and that's Ukraine's relation with the outside world. And in my book, I promote the thesis that Ukraine was not always isolated, that it does have some very rich connections with the outside world, that these have to be explored and written about. And that's what I tried to do in this particular book. And I was faced with some problems because because of the leftovers of censorship, it was hard to get some materials. It was hard to look them up. It was hard to find out what the story was. And I think this book is pioneering in a way, and others will come later on and go in greater depth in many of the aspects that I've explored here. For example, Pilgrims. You know, I've mentioned Pilgrims to you before. There's no book on Ukrainian pilgrims in the Middle East. There's no book about Ukrainian pilgrimage to Jerusalem, that sort of thing. There's no book about Ukrainian artists visiting the Middle East, and many of them did, and I discussed some of them in this book. There's no book about Ukrainian exiles and political activists working in the Ottoman Empire, or for that matter in Iran, and there were some. And there are many other aspects of the outside world that are ignored or have been ignored in Ukrainian history up to today. And the political exiles in particular hit the nail right on the head, because we were faced with censorship in this area, and now we can talk about it. But we have to move through a minefield. We have to discover new things and tell a new story. And I've only just begun to tell the story, and others will come after me, I'm sure. There are also some very, very difficult questions here. For example, the role of the Crimean Tatars in Ukrainian history. As it's generally written in Ukraine, the Tatars, and in Russia, the Tatars and the Crimean Tatars in particular are a negative factor. You know, there was Crimean Tatar slave raiding, and the slaves were taken to Turkey, and where they disappeared into Turkish society. And this is written in a very, very starkly negative manner, traditionally both by Russian historians and Soviet historians. And it was mandatory to write like in that tone. But of course, today the Crimean Tatars are allies of the Ukrainians. They don't like Russian rule in the Crimea. They prefer Ukrainian rule, which is less oppressive and more democratic. And it goes back to Gemilov and his I understand, and his experiences with Ukrainians in the camps in the Soviet Union, you know, and a lot of shared experiences. And developing out of that comes a friendship, and afterwards political friendship as well that exists right until the present time. So Ukrainians, on the other hand, have to reconcile this current political sympathy for the Crimean Tatars with the history of Tatar slave raiding in Ukraine. And I tried to do that in one of the chapters of this book, and it's titled Tatar Slave Raiding and Turkish Captivity in Ukrainian History and Legend. And they're both important. There's history and legend. And the legend is very great and all negative, but the history is not. The history is partly negative, but partly I have discovered there are some differences between slavery in the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire and slavery in the Americas. And I point this out in this particular essay. The question of the image of Ukraine in Middle Eastern scholarship is not really discussed in the literature that I looked at. First of all, the discipline of history is not as well developed in various Middle Eastern countries as it is in Western Europe. Okay. That's the first factor, very, very important factor. The second factor is Ukraine itself does not have a large, or did not until recently have a large presence in histories being written in Middle Eastern countries, because there was censorship in the Soviet Union and people did not distinguish between Russians and Ukrainians. In fact, very often they didn't even distinguish between, say, Azeri Turks living under the Russians and Russians. And they would call them Russians when they visited, say, Tehran or somewhere like that. This was before the revolution. So there's a long, long way to go for Ukraine as a state and as a people to be recognized fully in various Middle Eastern countries, and there's an awful lot to be done. So I've begun to do this in this particular book, and I think there are a few people in Ukraine as well working on this subject. And if you go back to the sources, there was a time when various Middle Eastern countries did distinguish between the Muscovites and the Cossacks, or the Muscovites and the Ukrainians. But that's primary material. It's not. It's hard to read, and it was written centuries ago. And current history is not does not have the same flavor. So all of that has to be integrated into new histories of relations between Ukraine and the Middle Eastern countries. I did one article, popular style article, that I published in the Ukrainian Weekly several years ago on Ukrainians and Turks and Tatars and their relations and all that sort of thing. And in that essay, I argued that they had close relations in the past, it wasn't all bad, and that there were influences back and forth. And I point out that business about names and how so many Ukrainian names, that, Tatarin is a very common Ukrainian name. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from Tartar, of course. And that person either had Tartar ancestry somewhere along the line, or he had a great-great-grandfather who looked like a Tartar, and so his neighbors called him Tatarin, and his son became Tatarsky, and this sort of thing. So, we had all kinds of influences back and forth, and it was a very well-received essay in Ukraine. It was printed in Sesvit, a popular Ukrainian magazine in Kiev. The Tatars today prefer, I believe they prefer without the R. And the R comes, the extra R, I think, comes from Tartarus, which was a kind of a negative thing that goes back to biblical times, and with images of hell and suffering and that sort of thing. So when the Mongols invaded Europe, the medieval Latin chroniclers said these are people coming from Tartarus, and the name stuck, and that's where it comes from. But I think that today the Tatar people prefer without the R, and that's the scholarly convention as well. The most important thing to know is that it's full of surprises. There's many, many things that people just don't talk about, but have interesting stories behind them. And they do have to do with Ukraine's relations with the outside world, whether this is personal names like Tatarin or Turchin or this sort of thing, which are very common in Ukraine, whether it's historical terms like Cossack coming from the Turkish or other things related to it, whether it's the names of places like Karasu in southern Ukraine, means black water in Turkish, whether it's the fortress of Akerman in southern Ukraine, which means white fortress, this type of thing. It's all over Ukraine today. It's all over Ukrainian history, and it's interesting to learn about these things and to find out where they come from and their meaning and that sort of thing. This is a big question in history, the influence of what they call the East in Russian history and perhaps in Ukrainian history. But historically speaking, the East in Russian history is a big question. And for many years, Russians were considered to be Asian. Russia was not Muscovy was not part of Europe on very old maps of Europe. The Europe ended at the Don River, and everything beyond the Don was Asia. So, and then in the time of Catherine II, she ordered that all the maps be altered, and Europe should extend to the Urals and not just to the Don. So it was by government fiat, that Russia became part of Europe. I think traditionally it's been oversimplified, the relations between Ukraine and the East generally, and the southern countries in particular. Generally it was told in a negative way, that everything coming from the Muslim world was negative. There was nothing good about it, and there are enemies. Full stop. Well, that's only partly true. It's true there are many wars, but there were also positive things too, and I point out some of them in this book. So I think that there's a lot to be done in that area, and a lot can be done. and will be done as Ukraine establishes more and more relations with the outside world, and in particular with its neighbors to the south and throughout the Middle East.